If you've ever wondered what the 1600s were like, imagine a modern world, but remove electricity, deodorant, antibiotics, and any concept of maybe it's just allergies. Also remove logic, sprinkle in a little hysteria, and add a suspicious amount of religious anxiety about goats. That's roughly the emotional temperature of Europe and colonial America in the 17th century. People were tired, itchy, and extremely confident that their neighbor's misfortune was caused by the widow next door who had a mole shaped vaguely like a comma. And so, naturally, we got witchcraft accusations. Not the glamorous broom-flying, spell-casting kind. More like, my cow stopped producing milk and I need someone to blame. A real cultural high point. But before we start casually strolling through the whimsical bureaucracy of witch accusing, witch examining, and witch punishing, we need to paint the proper backdrop. Because witchcraft accusations didn't just pop up out of nowhere, they were a product of a world where people were deeply committed to being wrong with confidence. Let's take a deep breath, settle into a comfortable position, preferably one significantly safer than a 1600s village hut, and wander into the wonderfully mediocre chaos of early modern witchcraft logic. The vibe of the 1600s, a world constantly having a bad day. Imagine an era where literally everything is slightly off. Everyone owns like 3 shirts, all of which itch. Food tastes like smoke and disappointment. Medicine consists mostly of bleeding you until you faint. And weather predictions are just men staring at clouds and shrugging. Life expectancy low. Survival confidence lower. Scientific literacy honestly subterranean. It was a world where people could look at a crop failure and go, could be soil, could be weather. Or maybe, hear me out, it was Agnes, because she frowned at me last week. This is what we're working with. So when misfortune struck, and it always struck, because history is basically one long list of things going wrong, the blame often fell on women who were slightly odd, slightly loud, slightly old, slightly poor, or slightly too good at minding their own business. Witchcraft accusations were less supernatural investigation and more a community acting like a group project gone horribly dysfunctional. Who got accused first? Spoiler, anyone who looked tired or owned a cat. Despite later legends romanticizing witches as powerful women brewing potions in the woods, the average accused woman looked less like a mythical enchantress and more like someone who had chronic joint pain and an opinion. Some classic early targets include 1. Widows. Honestly, widows were suspiciously independent. They lived alone. They survived their husbands. They maybe even read a Bible by themselves. Truly terrifying. 2. Single women over 40. In a time when people thought women expired at 30, this already felt supernatural. 3. Women who helped deliver babies. Midwives knew things. They washed their hands occasionally. They understood herbs. So obviously they had made a pact with Satan. 4. Women with unusual pets. Sometimes a goat. Sometimes a cat. Sometimes just a chicken with attitude. 5. Anyone generally disliked. A neighbor who complained too much. Witch. Someone who didn't share bread. Witch. Someone with resting annoyed face. Absolute witch. There was no consistent profile. The real criteria was, does this person mildly irritate me? If yes, perfect, which candidate? The accusation process. Local gossip meets bad theology. Accusations usually began with something extremely anticlimactic. A baby fell ill. A cow died. A family ran out of salted fish. Someone tripped over absolutely nothing on a Tuesday. From there, the community built an entire conspiracy theory. Marjorie passed by my house yesterday, and now my bread dough didn't rise. Coincidence? Obviously not. And then someone, usually the town's resident dramatic personality, made the official declaration. I knew there was something off about her. Which is, historically speaking, the 1600s version of a Twitter pile-on. Soon the neighbors joined in, adding helpful statements like, she muttered under her breath once. She looked at me strangely during a storm. She walked alone at night. She owns a book, with writing in it. It didn't take much. Entire trials began because someone's cousin's friend overheard someone say someone else had seen a woman acting suspiciously near a hedge. That was enough. The investigation, peak medieval HR department energy. Once accused, a woman entered a bureaucratic labyrinth that was somehow both extremely boring and extremely terrifying. Think of it as the worst job interview imaginable, run by people who had never seen a job and were suspicious of interviews. The goal wasn't to find the truth, it was to validate the accusation. Step 1. Community testimony. Basically, town gossip but legally binding. Neighbors recited things like, she once predicted the rain. She knows how to keep food from spoiling too fast. Her herbs are too effective. My child cried when she entered the room. People in the 1600s did not seem aware that babies cry at absolutely anything, including air. Step 2. Searching for the witch's mark. This was usually just a mole, a rash, a flea bite, a slightly suspicious freckle, a skin tag that looked vaguely like a punctuation mark. Inspectors, self-appointed experts with zero qualifications, poked at skin folds looking for devil's marks. Not the most glamorous historical profession. Step 3. Pricking. This involved sticking accused women with needles to see if they felt pain like a normal person. The scientific method, this was not. Often the needles were retractable, yes, literally rigged, so they could prove guilt regardless. It was basically the 1600s version of cheating on your own exam and still feeling proud about it. The confession. The world's most uncomfortable group therapy session. Confessions, when they happened, weren't discoveries of hidden satanic cults. They were the result of exhaustion, sleep deprivation, threats, or simply wanting the ordeal to end. A typical coerced confession might include lines like, yes, I talked to a spirit. Meaning, my cat meowed at me. Yes, I made a pact. Meaning, I was nice to someone once. Yes, I harmed livestock. Meaning, a goat looked at me funny. People confessed to whatever the community wanted to hear, just to get out of the spiraling madness. If the authorities expected details about Sabbaths or flying, the accused would provide them, often pulling inspiration from sermons or rumors because they had no idea what the correct answer was supposed to be. It was performance under pressure, except the stakes were significantly higher than a school play. The emotional tone of witch trials, bland panic and bureaucratic chaos. One of the funniest contradictions of the era is that the tone of witch trials was simultaneously deadly serious and incredibly boring. Courtrooms spent hours debating whether someone had smiled too warmly or baked bread too often. People testified about goats with suspicious eye contact. Men argued passionately about whether a mole was supernatural or just a mole. Meanwhile, the accused woman usually stood there like, I literally just exist. If you've ever had coworkers dramatically overreact to something trivial and turn it into an all-day meeting, congratulations. You already understand the emotional landscape of a witch trial. What happened after the trial? Spoiler, more mediocre bureaucracy. Contrary to dramatic movies, not all trials ended with public executions. Many ended anticlimactically with penance, fines, exile, imprisonment, house arrest, or simply, we're too tired to continue. Just go home and stop looking witchy. And when punishments were harsher, as in some European regions or later American colonies, they still followed a weirdly procedural, paperwork-heavy process. A woman might genuinely face death, but not before officials wrote 12 pages of slightly smudged notes about her suspicious laundry habits. Because nothing says justice system like paperwork. Part 1 Closing Tone. So that's the emotional and intellectual landscape of witch accusations in the 1600s. A world where everything was difficult, everyone was stressed, and the easiest solution to any unexplained inconvenience was to blame the nearest woman with a personality. In Part 2, we're going to wander, slowly, calmly, mildly amused, into what actually happened next, the odd rituals, the bureaucratic procedures, the community drama, and the very bland day-to-day reality of being an accused witch long before anything dramatic occurred. If Part 1 introduced the world of witchcraft accusations as a sort of historically themed community misunderstanding, Part 2 is where we settle into the slow, gentle descent that an accused woman experienced, not a dramatic fall, just an unremarkable slide, toward whatever mildly unfortunate outcome awaited her. It's important to approach this with the proper emotional tone. Imagine getting caught in a very boring customer service loop, except it's the 1600s, the representatives are clergymen, and instead of solving your issue, they're trying to decide if your elbow rash is demonic. Let's step into the process. So, what happened right after the accusation? Once a woman was accused of witchcraft, nothing immediate or thrilling occurred. Instead, the next phase began, waiting. A lot of waiting. You might imagine a dramatic arrest scene, but more often than not, the accused was simply told to stay available, while the local authorities gathered statements from anyone who had any grievance, no matter how unrelated. This included neighbors, neighbors' cousins, the baker, the baker's wife, the baker's wife's cousin, a random child who once saw the accused sneeze near a pond. Essentially, if anyone had ever felt uneasy, mildly uncomfortable, or simply needed attention, this was their moment. Officials compiled these statements into documents called Articles of Suspicion, which were basically a list of extremely normal human behaviors labeled as potentially supernatural. Things like, she walks too quietly. She sings while spinning wool. She knows the weather before it happens. Which, in reality, just meant she had functioning knees that could predict rain. So the accused woman spent this time continuing her daily life, feeding animals, preparing food, complaining about the cold, while fully aware that at any moment someone might knock on her door and say, "Hello, we need to talk about the time your bread rose too quickly." The formal summoning, mildly awkward and very inconvenient. When local officials finally felt they had assembled enough trivia about the accused, they formally summoned her to appear before them. Again, no drama. No torches. No angry mobs. Just a man with a hat saying something like, "Please present yourself for examination at your earliest convenience." It had the vibe of being called into the principal's office, if the principal believed in demons but still insisted on proper paperwork. At this point, the woman's role was simple. She had to show up, sit down, and listen to everyone list reasons they found her unsettling. Most testimonies were delivered in a serious tone, even if they sounded like this. When she churned butter, it made me uncomfortable. She once mumbled something I could not understand. She did not wave back when I waved at her across the field. You might wonder why no one said, "That seems a bit silly." Well, because that level of bravery had not yet evolved. The reputation spiral, when people suddenly remembered things. One of the most interesting, yet entirely predictable, parts of witch trials is what historians lovingly call the retrospective imagination phenomenon. In normal language, people suddenly remembered things that had never happened until the moment they were asked. For example, once a woman was accused, neighbors began recalling, with great confidence, incidents like, "My chicken stopped laying eggs after she visited." "Eggs stop laying when seasons change, but sure." "My child cried in her presence." "Babies cry around air." "I saw her talking to a bird. She was literally just feeding it crumbs." But in the minds of 1600s villagers, these events were not normal. They became evidence. It's kind of like when someone tells you they don't trust a coworker, and suddenly you start noticing every mildly suspicious thing that coworker does, even though they've been doing the same thing for years. Except in this case, the coworker was a woman in a wool dress trying to mind her business. The examination, a very uncomfortable medical checkup. Eventually, the accused was subjected to what officials called a physical examination, which was less science and more several people staring at your skin for too long. This exam could be conducted by midwives, local inspectors, self-appointed witch finders, or occasionally the town's most confident man. The examiners searched for warts, moles, scars, wrinkles, dry skin, or literally anything nature had placed on her body. In the 1600s, the human body was basically treated like a suspicious map full of clues no one actually knew how to interpret. If they found a mole, they called it a witch's teat. If they found a freckle, they labeled it a devil's mark. If they found nothing, they repeated the exam, because the idea of being wrong was unacceptable. Nothing was more threatening than a woman with normal, boring skin. The swimming test, yes, the one that makes no sense even by 1600 standards. While not as common as pop culture suggests, some regions did use the infamous swimming test, a procedure so illogical that even the 1600s must have felt embarrassed about it. The logic was something like this. Water is pure. Witches are impure. Therefore water will reject them. This meant that if a woman floated, she was guilty. If she sank, she was innocent. This created the world's least fun physics experiment. Buoyancy meant guilt. Drowning meant exoneration. Swimming ability was considered cheating. And holding onto the rope too tightly meant witchy behavior. Luckily, not every region used this test. Most preferred to stick with the more dignified method of poking women with needles while taking notes. The social impact, everyone pretending to feel concerned. While all of this was happening, the village or town behaved in a manner that was deeply theatrical, but in a calm, non-dramatic way. People avoided the accused woman politely. Not dramatically. Just enough to signal to others. I, too, am responsibly afraid. Neighbors might leave food at her doorstep, not out of kindness, but because they feared she would curse them if ignored. Some people offer gentle advice like, perhaps pray more. Others simply gossiped louder, while pretending they weren't gossiping at all. Children stared at her with wide eyes, partly because they were scared and partly because children stare at anything remotely unusual, including mud. Life continued, but with a sort of low-level buzzing anxiety. Not enough to cause chaos, just enough to make daily life awkward for everyone. The interrogation, a calmly miserable conversation. When authorities finally sat the accused down for questioning, they asked questions that ranged from slightly odd to deeply confusing. Why did you speak to a cat? Because it was meowing. Why were you near John's barn on Thursday? Because the path goes by the barn. Have you ever felt anger? Yes, but this answer would be dangerous. Do you know herbs? Well, yes, but now that's a problem. All of this took place in a room with poor lighting, a lot of wooden furniture, and the emotional atmosphere of a meeting where no one really wants to be there. Authorities weren't seeking clarity. They were seeking validation for beliefs they already held. The accused often tried to defend herself in the most reasonable way possible. I didn't curse your cow, cows just get sick. I didn't cause your headache, you haven't slept in 2 days. I didn't ruin your bread, you forgot the yeast. But logic has never been history's most popular hobby. So the interrogators nodded politely, wrote down nothing useful, and continued asking questions with the tone of people determined not to hear the answers. The very bland accumulation of evidence. By this point, the case file on the accused began to look impressively thick. Not because it contained meaningful information, just because small towns produced a lot of commentary. The evidence compiled usually included contradictory statements, vague memories, sketches of body marks, stern warnings about cats, someone's aunt's dream, theological speculation. The result was a very full folder of very empty facts. Officials treated this with total seriousness. Not because the evidence made sense, nothing made sense, but because admitting uncertainty was not an option for early modern officials, who maintained confidence the way people today collect phone notifications, constantly and without reflection. What the accused did during all of this, mostly chores. And what was the accused woman doing during this long, slow process? Mostly doing laundry, tending animals, cooking, repairing clothing, praying, feeling vaguely annoyed. The trials moved at the pace of molasses in winter. Days passed. Then weeks. Sometimes months. If she was imprisoned, it was in a small, uncomfortable cell. If she was released under watch, she returned home to a slightly more suspicious version of the same life she'd been living. Nothing was fast. Nothing was sharp. Nothing was dramatic. It was the historical equivalent of being on hold, forever, while listening to the same church hymn played badly on a lute. The psychological toll, quiet, slow-burning exhaustion. People today imagine constant panic, but the reality was more tired. Accused women rarely screamed or fainted or caused scenes. Instead, they experienced fatigue, confusion, resignation, the slowly dawning realization that no one was actually listening. The emotional tone of their experience was less terror and more exhausted disappointment, which honestly feels extremely relatable. By the time final proceedings began, many accused women had mentally checked out of the entire situation. Not dramatically, just with the calm acceptance of people who realized the only thing left to do was let events unfold at their glacial pace. End of part 2. If you'd like, I can continue straight into part 3, where we go through day-to-day life while under suspicion. The community politics of witch trials. What trials actually looked like minute by minute. The slow, procedural steps toward verdicts. The extremely anticlimactic bureaucracy of early modern justice. By the time a woman reached the formal trial stage, life had already become a slow-moving historical inconvenience. Nothing was thrilling. Nothing was fast. Everything unfolded with the same energy as a small-town committee meeting where everyone has ideas but no one actually wants to implement anything. This part of the story is where we enter the full machinery of the early modern justice system, an experience that can only be described as tediously dramatic, which is to say, the drama was in theory, not in execution. So let's stroll, leisurely, of course, through what happened next. Court day arrives, the least exciting event of the month. When the day of the hearing finally came, it was not the grand spectacle people imagine today. There were no shouting mobs, no chaotic energy, no pitchforks or torches, mostly because the villagers needed the pitchforks for actual work. Instead, the courtroom atmosphere felt like a mild community gathering where people came to stretch their legs, listen to gossip, judge quietly, and enjoy the novelty of being indoors. People gathered slowly, with the emotional intensity of attendees at a mandatory church potluck. They brought no anticipation of excitement, just a familiar mixture of boredom and polite curiosity. Meanwhile, the accused woman arrived escorted by a few officials who looked tired, because they usually were. Their job required them to listen to 20 separate testimonies about chickens, dreams, and mysterious breezes. The courtroom, a whole lot of wood and even more opinions. If you imagine a grand courtroom like in modern legal dramas, adjust that picture. Reduce the scale, increase the creakiness, and add several people who don't fully understand the legal process but feel personally invested anyway. The room usually contained a long table for officials who pretended to take notes, hard benches where the public sat uncomfortably, a window that let in cold air but not enough light, a judge or magistrate who looked like he had somewhere else to be, a clerk copying everything down poorly, a general atmosphere of musty seriousness. It was, in essence, the kind of room where nothing exciting had ever happened, and nothing exciting ever would. Reading the accusations, a very long list of very small things. Before any discussion began, the list of accusations was read aloud. This was usually the longest and most unintentionally comedic part of the day. Charges often included: she spoke sharply to a goat. She appeared near the well on the morning it froze. She knew herbs without being instructed by a man. She frowned when asked about the weather. She was seen humming during a storm. And, my personal favorite, found in various records, her presence made me uneasy. Which is, admittedly, not a crime in modern courts, but in the 1600s, it was practically a felony. The entire list was read in a serious tone, as if the fate of the kingdom depended on whether a woman had once baked bread too consistently. The accused stood silently through this, usually thinking variations of, "I can't believe this is happening. This is nonsense. I should have moved to another village 10 years ago." Witness testimonies, community theater, but slower. Next came the parade of witnesses, the highlight of the event for the audience, but a test of patience for everyone else. Witnesses approached the stand with varying degrees of confidence, often delivering statements that had the vibrant energy of someone repeating a rumor they only half understood. Typical testimonies included: the nervous neighbor. I saw her whispering near the garden, and the next day my carrots were small. Carrot failure was extremely common, regardless of witchcraft. The dramatic elder. She stared at me once, and that night my back hurt terribly. Back pain, also extremely common. The kid who was forced to participate. She looked at me and I felt scared. Kids are scared of hats, shadows, and loud geese. Still counts. The person with a dream. In my dream, I saw her flying. This must mean something. It meant the dreamer was hungry or cold, but dreams were considered admissible. Authorities wrote these statements down with straight faces, even if the content sounded like rejected fairy tale drafts. The accused woman listened with a look that can only be described as grimly patient. The clergy's role: serious faces, vague opinions. Many trials involved the local minister who provided theological commentary. This commentary rarely clarified anything, but it added a religious weight to the proceedings, because nothing says fairness like letting someone whose job is to fear demons decide whether you're guilty of consorting with one. Clergy members said things like, "The devil is known to work subtly. Women are more susceptible to temptation. Ill fortune may be a sign of dark influence. Which translates to, we don't know, but let's pretend we do. Their presence increased the solemnity, though not the logic, of the trial. The accused speaks, calm, reasonable, and largely ignored. When the woman was finally allowed to speak, she usually did so with remarkable restraint. She explained things like, "The goat was loud, so I shushed it. I was near the well because I needed water. I use herbs because they help stomach pains. Your carrots were small because the soil is terrible." Her tone was not angry, anger looked suspicious. It was not panicked, panic looked guilty. Instead, it was the steady, weary tone of someone explaining common sense to people determined not to understand it. Authorities nodded politely and wrote down very little. The audience nodded politely and understood even less. That's because the narrative was already built. Logic had very little room to grow here. The character testimony portion, flawed but confident opinions. After the accused finished speaking, the court often invited character testimonies. These were short, simple opinions like, "She has always been a quiet woman." Interpreted as, mysterious. "She keeps to herself." Interpreted as, hiding something. "She helps sick neighbors." Interpreted as, suspiciously knowledgeable. "She once raised her voice." Interpreted as, unnatural temper. The human ability to turn neutral traits into ominous ones was truly at its peak during witch trials. It was the Olympic sport of early modern communities. The expert examiner, a person with confidence, not expertise. Sometimes the court brought in a witch examiner, a title that sounded authoritative but required zero actual medical or scientific knowledge. This examiner delivered statements like, "I found a mark under her arm. It was a rash. The mark did not bleed when pricked. The needle was retractable. This indicates a familiar spirit may suckle there." It indicated nothing of the sort. Spectators nodded with solemn concern, as though listening to a doctor, even though no one involved had the faintest idea what constituted a reliable test. The accused woman listened with the steady endurance of someone listening to a bad lecture on a topic they already understand better than the speaker. The clerical lecture, a moment of theological rambling. Before the court retired to consider the verdict, a local minister often gave a short moral message, which was part sermon, part warning, and part self-promotion. It usually sounded something like, "We must be vigilant against the darkness that seeks to enter our homes and our hearts. Satan prowls among us, and he works through those who are weak in spirit. Therefore, let us search our consciences." Which really meant, "Everyone please keep supporting the church budget." It added gravity to the proceedings without clarifying anything, contributing to the overall tone of serious confusion. Deliberation, men in hats whispering in a corner. Unlike today's complex jury systems, 1600s deliberations were extremely simple. A few officials gathered in a corner. They whispered. They occasionally scratched their chins. Someone sighed dramatically. Someone else suggested more prayer. They didn't weigh evidence the way we think of evidence today. Instead, they weighed community pressure, religious expectations, political convenience, awkwardness, and whether they personally found the accused unsettling. It was a gut-feeling process, which is historically never a good sign. The waiting period, a moment of bland tension. While officials deliberated, the accused woman sat quietly. Not crying. Not panicking. Mostly tired. People watched her from across the room. Some felt sorry but didn't say so. Some felt vindicated in their suspicions. Most felt nothing in particular, they simply wanted to see how this very slow situation resolved. The room filled with a hushed anticipation, not because something exciting might happen, but because everyone needed closure so they could go home and prepare dinner. The verdict: calm voices, heavy consequences. When officials returned, they delivered the verdict with a flat, measured tone. If she was found not guilty, it sounded like, "We find insufficient proof at this time." She would be released, though people would still avoid her for months, just in case. If she was found guilty, the wording was usually, "We find evidence of malefic practices." Still calm. Still formal. Still bureaucratic. Unlike dramatic retellings, guilty verdicts were not met with shouting. No cheering. No cries of joy. Just a quiet, resigned acceptance that this was the result, for better or worse. Post-trial life, the emotional whiplash of normalcy. If released, the accused often returned to normal life within hours. Feeding chickens. Boiling water. Mending clothes. Feeling exhausted. People avoided her, but only mildly. Life continued. If found guilty of a minor offense, she might face a fine, forced penance, public confession, or a period of house arrest. If you've made it this far in our very calm, very uneventful stroll through witch-related bureaucracy of the 1600s, congratulations, you're officially more patient than most colonial governors of the time. Now, in this part, we shift from the accusation machinery to the actual daily lives of the women involved, because nothing screams witchcraft panic quite like extremely normal women being treated like they're secretly hoarding potions, curses, and possibly a mildly judgmental crow. And remember, we are not doing drama, suspense, or surprise reveals. This is the 1600s, after all. Most days were just chores, mild aches, and people arguing about bread. The women behind the accusations, spoiler, they were mostly just tired. Let's begin with a simple truth. Women accused of witchcraft were rarely doing anything more magical than surviving a century that smelled like wet wool and disappointment. Most of these women fit into one of these extremely glamorous categories. 1. Widows. 2. Single older women. 3. Women with attitude, aka they spoke occasionally. 4. Midwives. 5. Poor women who owned one too many cats. 6. Anyone who annoyed a neighbor on a Wednesday. That's it. You didn't need a broomstick, a spell book, or even a slightly dramatic cloak. You mostly just needed a personality that wasn't universally adored. Let's describe their daily routine in the flattest, most historically accurate way possible. A day in the life of a 1600s witch, who wasn't a witch. Imagine waking up on a straw mattress, which was exactly as comfortable as it sounds. Your house smells faintly of smoke, onions, and whatever questionable herbal tea you brewed last night because your joints hurt. You step outside. And your neighbor, Margaret, immediately stares at you like you purposely allowed her chicken to stop laying eggs. Which, in fact, you did not. But Margaret is in a mood today. Now the thing about the 1600s is that everyone was in a mood, all the time. No one was getting enough protein, sleep, or emotional validation. So any tiny inconvenience, illness, spoiled milk, dead sheep, husband with a headache, could magically become someone else's fault. Preferably a woman's fault. Preferably a woman who wasn't married, cheerful, or wealthy. So the accused women weren't exactly living thrilling supernatural lives. Their witchcraft schedule would have looked something like 6 a.m., wake up. 6:30 a.m., feed animals. 7 a.m., boil water and think about nothing. 9 a.m., listen to neighbor complain about something. 12 p.m., chores. 3 p.m., more chores. 6 p.m., feel tired. 8 p.m., sleep. Somewhere in there, a completely unrelated tragedy would happen in the village, a child falling ill or a cow making a weird noise. And suddenly, the woman who was minding her own business becomes the prime suspect in a supernatural conspiracy she absolutely didn't have the energy for. The witch personality myth. Many modern people picture accused witches as confident, rebellious, mysterious, wearing flowing black dresses, communing with bats, deeply sarcastic. But honestly, most of them were just slightly inconvenient people. Maybe they didn't flatter the local minister enough. Maybe they charged more than $0 for midwife services. Maybe they had opinions. In 1600 society, having opinions was already witch-coded behavior. Let's introduce 3 extremely typical, extremely non-magical personality types that frequently landed women in trouble. 1. The grumpy widow witch. She complained about taxes. She complained about weather. She complained about people who complained too much. Her crime: being over 40 and having zero interest in pretending to be cheerful about it. If she told someone to leave her alone, and that person later tripped over a bucket, well, clearly she hexed them. 2. The midwife who actually knows things, witch. Midwives knew herbs. Knowing herbs meant having knowledge. Having knowledge meant possibly outsmarting men. Men did not enjoy this. Case closed. 3. The quiet one with a cat witch. She read the Bible alone. She fed her cat before feeding herself. She didn't enjoy small talk. Clearly a threat. The distinct lack of actual magic. Let's be very clear here. None of these women were secretly brewing potions or casting curses. If anything, They were trying extremely hard to not get involved in other people's problems. But the 1600s loved turning tiny personal conflicts into town-wide moral crises. For example, if a woman said, "Good morning," in the wrong tone, someone would write it down. If she loaned a neighbor a pot, and the pot later broke, she must have bewitched the pot. If she ever gave someone a gift and the person got sick a week later, the gift was definitely cursed. If a poor woman asked for butter and didn't get it, and then the cow got sick, well, obviously she cursed the cow with her disappointment energy. And unfortunately for these women, the word witch stuck to them the way smoke sticks to fabric. Their homes, shockingly normal and slightly damp. There's a myth that accused witches lived in creepy, forested huts with eerie dried herbs hanging everywhere. Not really. Most lived in small, unimpressive houses that could be described as wooden, cold, slightly drafty, entirely beige, containing 2 chairs, 1 pot, and a cat named something like Moppet. Their homes weren't cauldrons and crystals aesthetic, they were more. I hope the roof doesn't fall in today. If anything, the only witchy thing about these homes was the smell, which wasn't mystical so much as, this is what happens when you live near livestock and don't have plumbing. Their appearance, practical, unmagical, slightly wrinkled. Accused witches didn't wear dramatic outfits. They wore wool dresses, aprons, bonnets. Probably the same shawl every day for 10 years. And their general vibe wasn't mysterious sorceress. It was tired woman who has been farming since dawn. Their hair, usually tied back and aggressively unmagical. Their eyes, probably squinting because glasses weren't a thing. Their posture, absolutely ruined by lifting buckets. If you transported any accused witch into the modern world, she wouldn't look like a fantasy character, she'd look like someone who really wants to sit down. The reputation spiral, how innocent women became local legends. Once someone was accused, even informally, every tiny detail of their past suddenly became evidence. The time she sneezed during a church service, suspect. The fact that she didn't get sick when everyone else had the flu, suspicious. The time her cat hissed at someone, deeply concerning. The 1600s were full of what I'd call retrospective imagination, meaning townspeople would retroactively decide that something normal was actually witch-like. For example, "Oh yes, now that I think about it, she did once look at my child for too long." Or, "She always walks so quietly, like she's trying not to be heard." Or my personal favorite, "She doesn't smile." Definitely a witch. Basically, these women became folklore characters while they were still alive, and not the fun kind of folklore. More like the "someone saw her pick up a stick in a weird way" kind. What they actually wanted out of life, not that anyone asked. Most accused women wanted extremely normal things. A warm meal, fewer chores, some peace, fewer judgmental neighbors, maybe a candle that didn't smell like tallow. Absolutely no supernatural responsibilities. If someone had offered them the option to be magical, they probably would have declined, because magic sounded like extra work, people asking for favors, even more reasons to be blamed for things. These women didn't want drama. They wanted to go to bed at 8 p.m. without being accused of meeting the devil. The unexpectedly calm emotional landscape. Now, you might assume these women were living in fear or stress every day. But many accused witches lived surprisingly calm lives. Not because life was easy, but because life was already difficult, and being accused of witchcraft was just another irritating problem. They had a sort of emotional numbness that comes from surviving multiple harsh winters, losing crops, raising children in tiny houses, dealing with village gossip, enduring unreliable husbands, walking everywhere, lacking basic comforts. In an odd way, the accusation wasn't thrilling or terrifying. It was more like, oh, this again. Wonderful. Very on brand for the century. The social life of an accused witch. Imagine being the person everyone whispers about. Some neighbors avoid you. Some stare. Some pretend they didn't hear the rumors. Some ask you for help and then whisper about you later. But there was no dramatic isolation montage here. Accused women often continued their chores, visited markets, attended church, borrowed tools. Basically living life as usual, just with a reputation that ranged from eccentric to possibly cursed. Sometimes people were afraid of them. Sometimes children dared each other to knock on their door. Sometimes people were overly polite to avoid being hexed. In a very unintentionally comedic way, many witches were treated like unpredictable weather patterns. Let's ease ourselves gently, very gently, into Victorian England, a place that managed to combine industrial progress, rampant soot, and an unwavering belief that children were essentially small, replaceable employees. Before we wander into the topic of children being sold, it's worth noting that Victorians had several creative ways of avoiding that specific word. They preferred terms like placed into service, indentured, apprenticed, hired out, sent away for their own good, temporarily assigned, or my personal favorite, beneficially relocated. All of which meant basically the same thing. Your child would now be waking up in someone else's house and scrubbing someone else's floors. But let's not rush. This is a calm walk, not a sprint. The setting, an England that loved chimneys and underpaid children. Victorian England, 1837 to 1901, was a wonderful place if you enjoyed working 12 hours a day, inhaling coal dust, and having the average life expectancy of a modern household plant. Adults struggled, of course, but children, well, children were basically seen as future workers, potential workers, or, if one was feeling particularly generous, miniature workers in training. A child was considered emotionally complete by age 6, and economically useful by age 8. Victorians didn't dislike children, exactly. They just saw them as slightly defective adults who needed polishing. The families, tired, poor, and doing their best, sort of. Most families who sold or handed over their children weren't villains twirling mustaches. They were simply overworked, underpaid, mildly confused, and frequently overwhelmed. In other words, classic Victorian parents. You have to imagine them living in extremely crowded houses, sometimes entire families of 7 or 8 people sharing a single room, which smelled faintly of stew, mildew, and unresolved stress. These parents didn't wake up thinking, "Let's outsource our children today." They woke up thinking, "Do we have food?" Followed by, "No." Well, that's unfortunate. So when a local landowner, a wealthy household, or a factory supervisor mentioned they were looking for a servant girl of about 10 or a boy who can sweep chimneys, parents often nodded politely and agreed before asking themselves whether 10 was actually a reasonable age for full-time employment. Spoiler, it wasn't. Introducing the children, small, underfed, and accidentally employed. Victorian children came in 2 basic varieties. 1. Those born into poverty. 2. Those born into slightly less poverty but still heading toward the same fate. They were usually undernourished, undersized, and overwhelmingly confused by adulthood. Their hobbies included trying to find bread, climbing things they weren't supposed to climb, and wondering why everyone around them coughed so much. Nobody asked these children whether they wanted to enter domestic service. That would imply they had preferences, a concept Victorian society found adorable but unnecessary. The transfer process, not quite a sale, but not a sale. When a child entered service, the moment was rarely ceremonial. Nobody wrapped the child in fine cloth or handed over a receipt. It usually went like this. A neighbor said they knew someone who needed help. A man in a hat knocked on your door. Or a woman with the expression of someone who collects porcelain dolls approached you at church. The negotiation was bland and very British. The parent might say, "She's 10 but strong for her age." The employer might reply, "Excellent. Does she sweep quietly?" The payment, if any, was usually not given to the child. It was sent to the parents who desperately needed it to buy bread, coal, and occasionally a new bucket if last winter had destroyed the old one. Sometimes the parents received room and board in exchange, which was considered a great bargain at the time, even though room and board meant a small corner of someone's attic, shared with moths. Entering the new household, awkward silence and immediate chores. Upon arrival at their new place of employment, children were greeted with a classic Victorian welcome. Mild confusion, a lack of enthusiasm, and a sense that nobody fully remembered hiring them. Domestic staff treated them like curious little experiments. Not quite co-workers, not quite pets, something in between. The new child servant's introduction usually sounded like this. "This is Mary. She's here to help in the kitchen." Or, "This is Thomas. He's small, so he'll be cleaning the flues." Nothing dramatic. Just an announcement, followed by a quiet from whoever happened to be nearby. Then the child went straight to work, because nothing says adjusting to a new environment like peeling potatoes under supervision. What their days actually looked like, spoiler, repetitive. Children in service had schedules that were very predictable, which is great if you like consistency and terrible if you enjoy sleeping. A typical day. 5 a.m., wake up. 5:10 a.m., start chores. All day, continue chores. Evening, more chores. Night, collapse into bed. The household hierarchy was strict, but not dramatic. There were no scandals or emotional breakdowns. Mostly just passive-aggressive instructions and the occasional sigh. The work included sweeping, dusting, carrying water, polishing things, unpolishing things accidentally, and apologizing repeatedly. Children who became chimney sweeps had slightly more excitement, but since we are avoiding drama, we will not focus on that. Let's simply say chimneys existed, and children existed, and Victorians placed those two facts together with predictable results. The clothing situation, bland, durable, and slightly uncomfortable. Child servants didn't wear uniforms in the modern sense. They wore hand-me-downs from the household, patched aprons, sturdy shoes, and the emotional equivalent of beige. Their outfits were functional, stiff, and frequently several sizes too large. This gave them the charming appearance of a small person borrowed from a painting that hadn't been finished. Their personalities, mild, polite, and easily startled. Contrary to the idea that child workers were bold or rebellious, most Victorians expected them to be quiet, obedient, polite, and minimally visible. Many children became experts in the art of standing still. If you placed them in a hallway, they could remain there indefinitely, like small pieces of furniture. Children were praised for their invisibility, which, in a very literal sense, became their main job skill. Their employers, not evil, just mildly detached. The employers weren't cartoon villains. They were distracted, extraordinarily formal, mildly self-important, and deeply concerned with the shine level of their silverware. They had little emotional connection with the children who served them. Servants existed in that blurry zone between necessary and not worth discussing. A child might work in a household for years and still be referred to simply as the girl or the boy. Victorians had a remarkable ability to keep emotional distance from anyone responsible for doing their laundry. The parents' feelings, complicated but quiet. You might imagine Victorian parents weeping dramatically as their children left home, but that would require dramatic emotion, which Victorians found distasteful. The truth is far flatter. Parents felt sad, relieved, uncertain, hopeful, and mostly tired. But they expressed these feelings quietly, because emotions were meant to be folded neatly and stored away like winter coats. They simply hoped their children would find food, warmth, slightly less chaos, and maybe a chance at stability. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was often the only one. Why this system continued, habit, poverty, and British politeness. Child service arrangements were so common that nobody questioned them. It was simply how things are done. And Victorians excelled at doing things simply because they had been done before. Whenever someone questioned the morality of placing 10-year-olds in full-time labor, others responded with the classic Victorian mindset. Well, it seems to be working fine. And that was that. End of part 1. If you're ready, say, continue part 2, and I'll move into daily routines in more detail. Household expectations. Child behavior norms. Quirky Victorian family habits. How children slowly became invisible workers. And more mildly interesting but decidedly not exciting sections. All in the same flat, slow-paced, humorous historical tone.